In this lecture, I am going to tell you a secret. And that secret is that final and override are not keywords in C++. And because of this, we can really do crazy things. Okay, so are you ready? Let's look at this. We can do a statement like this in our C++ program. We say our type, we say final, the variable name is going to be named final, and we can put in a value, and this is going to work. We can even declare a variable named override and give it any type, and this is really going to work. But this is confusing, but C++ allows us to do this. So some of you must be thinking, why on earth would a C++ programming language allow us to do something like this? Well, final and override are identifiers. And these identifiers were introduced in C++ 11. If we go to CPP reference to look at their documentation, we're going to see that they were introduced in C++ 11. And at this point, I think the C++ designers thought that there might be code out there that uses these things already in the programs. For example, we have variables named override. For example, we have classes named final and things like this. And they don't want old code to break. So they still allow people to use these things as variable names or whatever, but this is no longer recommended in new C++ code, even if it's going to compile. So it is going to compile if you do this, and we will see that in a minute when we hit Visual Studio Code, but please don't do this. It is going to make your code much more confusing, and you should really consider this to be keywords in C++, even if the compiler is going to allow you to use them as variable names or class names or whatever. Just know this. Okay, we can even do something as crazy as this. We can declare we can even do something as crazy as this. We can declare a class and name it final. This is going to compile, but this is really confusing. Don't do this in your code. Again, as people say, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do this. And this is a good example of something you shouldn't do, even if you can do this. Okay, now that we know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Here we are in our working folder. The current project is final and override are not keywords. This is a good name, I think. We're going to grab our template files. We're going to put them in place. And we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. We have our main CPP file. We can clean it up a little bit and remove what we don't need here. And what we really want to do is super simple. We just want to show you that you can use the final and override identifiers as variable names. So for example, you can say double final and put in a value 3.4, for example. And this is going to compile and work. Hopefully you can see how confusing this can be. You can say stdc out final and put this out. We're going to see that this is going to compile and run. If we run this through GCC, this is going to work just fine. The build is good. We have our rooster binary. We can bring up a PowerShell window to really play with us. And if we run this, we're going to see our value printed out. We can even use override here. This is also going to work because these are not proper C++ keywords. So we can use these as variable names. Let's say override here. And you're going to see that this is going to be valid C++ code. As crazy as it sounds, it is going to compile and run. And this is really confusing. The build is good. We can clear and run rooster. And this is going to work just fine. We can even use these guys as class names. So for example, we can go on top here and say class override. Okay, we're going to have something like this. And this is going to work and build and run. If we build this with GCC, we're going to see that the build is going to be good. We can use these guys as variable names or class names, and this is going to work. Just to put this in context, if, for example, you create a class named if, because if is a C++ keyword, this is going to be a compiler error because you can't do this. You can't use these keywords as variable names or as class names because they are reserved internally to the C++ programming language. But as we saw, override and final are not proper keywords because they were introduced in C++ 11, and the designers of C++ still wanted old code that might be using these things as variable names or class names to still work. But you shouldn't really use them as variable names or class names in new C++ code because that's going to make your code just confusing. I really want you to know this. This is really all I had to show in this lecture. Hopefully you know that you shouldn't really use these guys as variable names or class names or whatever. You should leave them to C++. You should, in fact, think of them as proper C++ keywords. That's going to make the code you write with C++ much safer. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to zoom in on how polymorphic or virtual functions work with access specifiers. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.